up now. We know it's the presidential car. You can see Mrs. Kennedy's pink suit. There's a Secret Service man, spread eagle, over the top of the car. We can't see who has been hit if something is terribly wrong.
The usual welcoming committee presents Mrs. Kennedy with a bouquet of red roses.
The president's car is now turning onto Elm Street, and it will be only a matter of minutes before he arrives at the trademark. It appears as though something has happened in the motorcade route. Something, I repeat, has happened in the motorcade route.
From the AP bulletin, Kennedy apparently shot in head. He fell face down in back seat of his car. Blood was on his head. Mrs. Kennedy cried, "Oh no," and tried to hold up his head.
Dallas police this morning resumed questioning the man they have formally charged with the assassination of President Kennedy. The man is 24-year-old Lee Oswald. Oswald was arrested less than 2 hours after the president was shot, less than 1 hour after a Dallas policeman was shot and killed in the downtown area. Oswald first was charged with killing the policeman. Officers say they have an eyewitness to that shooting. After further questioning, he was formally charged with the president's death.
When you see all the evidence that I lay out in this video, I believe you will conclude with me that Lee Harvey Oswald did not kill JFK. Lee Oswald did not fire a shot. And don't take my word for it. Do your own research. By all means, read the Warren Commission report, which is the official account of what happened. Then tell me if you think the Warren Commission report makes any sense at all. Here's what Oswald says.
I don't know what this is all about.
Kill the president?
No, sir, I didn't. People keep asking me that. Sir?
You shoot the president?
I work in that building.
Were you in the building at the time?
Naturally, if I work in that building, yes, sir.
Back up, man. Did you shoot the president?
No, they're taking me in because of the fact that I lived in the Soviet Union. I'm just a patsy.
I agree with Oswald. Oswald was the patsy. He was the fall guy set up by the CIA. And I have provided links to my source material in the notes below.
John Kennedy was killed by a major force. The simplest way to describe it is a Central Intelligence Agency. Lee Harvey Oswald killed no one at all. So the point is, it wasn't a question of being alone or with anybody. He had nothing to do with the assassination.
But you might ask, why am I doing a video about something that happened more than 60 years ago? Couldn't I think of a topic that would be more relevant to talk about today? Well, the reason I'm talking about the JFK assassination is because the CIA is as malevolent a force today as it was back then. In fact, I believe that the CIA is even more dangerous, more sophisticated, and more totalitarian now than it was in 1963. I believe that the most serious threat to the American people, the most serious threat to our freedom, does not come from communist China or Vladimir Putin. The real threat to the American people, the real threat to your freedom, comes from the CIA, and the deep state comes from our own government. Now, I used to be very pro-CIA. I used to think that the CIA was doing mostly good things to keep America safe. Sure, the CIA made mistakes, I thought, got it wrong sometimes. But overall, I saw the CIA as something we definitely need. And I still believe we need the CIA, or something like it, as originally conceived, as originally sold to the American people. Beware the military-industrial complex, President Eisenhower warned us. And he would know. He was the Supreme Allied Commander during World War II. He knew well what the military-industrial complex is capable of. Now, the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, was supposed to be about gathering information. It's the Central Intelligence Agency, not the Central Political Assassinations Agency. We certainly want good intelligence. We want and need good information. We want to know what's going on and what our adversaries are doing, so our elected leaders can make intelligent decisions based on good information, based on good intelligence. What we don't want is the CIA killing America's elected political leaders if the CIA doesn't happen to like the leaders we elect. What we don't want is the CIA manipulating America's elections and conducting propaganda campaigns, hoaxes, and psyops against the American people. And when I say CIA, the CIA, of course, coordinates with other elements of our government, coordinates with the FBI, the military, the Department of Homeland Security, the Secret Service, local police forces, and other agencies of our government. And there are 18 intelligence agencies within our federal government. This is what we mean when we refer to the deep state. So it's all these agencies. All of them must be dismantled, torn up, root and branch. We really need to start over with our federal government. But it's the CIA that's the head of the snake. The CIA sees itself as the real government of America. Elections are just for show, to be manipulated by the CIA. American presidents are just temporary figures, just passing through. Elected officials, for the most part, are just puppets to be manipulated by the CIA. And whenever a leader steps forward who starts asking questions, who starts blowing the whistle, who says, "Hey, wait a minute, I'm not liking what I'm seeing here," well, bad things tend to happen to that person. The CIA also delivers propaganda talking points to the media. The CIA sees its primary objective not as protecting the United States from foreign threats through the collection of good information. Now, that's supposed to be its mission. The CIA sees its primary mission as control of the American people through manipulation, propaganda, harassment, intimidation, blackmail, lawfare, and when none of that works, murder. That was true in JFK's day, and it's even more true today. And the CIA has much better technology now. That's why we need to take a look at what happened to Lee Harvey Oswald. Because the assassination of JFK by the CIA is the clearest, most vivid example of how powerful and how dangerous the CIA is. Lee Harvey Oswald was just 24 years old when he allegedly shot and killed President John F. Kennedy from a 6-story window in Dallas, Texas at 12:30 p.m. on November 22nd, 1963. And we're told that just 45 minutes after Oswald killed JFK, he also gunned down a Dallas police officer, J.D. Tippit, 3 miles away in the Oak Cliff area of Dallas at 1:15 p.m. He also, between these events, stopped off at his residence where he was seen by his landlady. Then 1 mile from Oswald's residence, we're told he put 3 bullets in the chest of Officer Tippit. Then when Officer Tippit was lying on the ground, we're told that Oswald calmly walked up to Tippit and finished him off with a bullet to the head, then walked off calmly. Again, this was just 45 minutes after Oswald supposedly killed JFK. Supposedly shot JFK from a 6th-floor window in a big building. So let's hear from one of the witnesses to the shooting of Officer Tippit. Let's hear what a housekeeper named Aquila Clemens has to say.
Mrs. Clemens, where were you on November 22nd, 1963?
Just down the block from where Tippit was killed.
Did you know Officer Tippit?
Yes, I saw him pretty many times.
And did you hear the shots?
Yes, I heard the shots.
And what did you do?
I ran out into the street and looked down the street, and I ran back down the street where he was lying, and I looked at him.
Now, when you heard the shots and you went out of the house, did you see a man with a gun?
Yes, I did.
What was he doing?
Oh, he was reloading it. When I said he was reloading his gun.
And how would you describe that man?
Well, he's kind of chunky. He's kind of heavy. He wasn't a very big man.
Was he tall or short?
Yeah, he's kind of short guy.
Short and heavy?
Yes.
And was there any other man there?
Yes, there was one on the other side of the street. All I know, he told him to go.
Mrs. Clemens, the man who had the gun, did he make any motion at all to the other man across the street?
No more told him to go.
Well, he waved his hand and said, go on.
Go.
And then what happened with the man with the gun?
He unloaded and reloaded.
And what did the other man do?
Man kept going straight down the street.
And then did they go in opposite directions?
Yes, they was. They wasn't together. They went this way from each other. The one done the shooting went this way. The other one went straight down past street that way.
What was the man who did not do the shooting, but the man who went in the other direction from the man with the gun? What was he wearing, if you remember?
Well, first I remember he had looked like light khakis and a white shirt.
And was he tall or short?
He was tall.
And was he heavy or thin?
He was thin.
But the one who did the one who had the gun, seconds after Tippit was shot, he was short.
Yes,
he
was short and kind of heavy.
Oh, so the man with the gun was short and heavy. looked nothing like Oswald. Some say he sounds like Jack Ruby. Oswald was 5'9", 135 pounds. And the guy across the street she sees, she describes as tall and thin in a white t-shirt. But when Oswald was arrested in that movie theater 7 blocks away, he was wearing a beige-colored windbreaker, a long-sleeved brownish patterned woven shirt with a button-down front, and button wrist cuffs. Now under that he did have a white crewneck t-shirt, the one that we see him in photos at the police station, but this white t-shirt was not visible upon his arrest. He was also wearing dark chino or khaki casual slacks, dark crew socks, and black Oxford shoes for work. So Oswald looked nothing like the second man Miss Clemens described either. Then, according to Miss Clemens, someone arrived at her house about 2 days after this and told her that she might get hurt if she talked about what she saw.
Now, did you testify before the Warren Commission about this case?
I haven't said anything to anyone.
Did anyone come to see you after the murder of Officer Tippit?
Yes, he was a man came, I don't know what he was. He came to my house and talked to me. But I don't know what he looked like a policeman to me.
He did. Did he have a gun?
Yes, he wore a gun.
Mrs. Clemens, how long after Tippit was shot did this man with a gun come to visit you?
About 2 days. It was about 2 days. Said that I might get hurt. Someone might hurt me if I would talk.
About what you saw?
What I saw. He just told me to be the best if I didn't say anything because I might get hurt.
And told her that she might get hurt if she talked about what she saw. And 37 minutes after the shooting of Officer Tippit, Oswald was arrested at the Texas movie theater 7 blocks away. But there's a problem with the timeline. A witness, a man named Warren Butch Burroughs, who was both taking tickets and running the concession stand in the theater, says he saw Oswald at the theater at 1:05 or 1:07 p.m. He remembers the time clearly because he says the movie starts at 1 p.m. every day. Officer Tippit was shot at 1:15 p.m.
We were playing 2 movies called War is Hell with Audie Murphy and Cry Battle with Van Heflin. And we started the movie at 1 o'clock, and I was counting candy behind the candy case. And he also slipped in around between 1 and 1:07.
So if Oswald was in the theater at 1:05 or 1:07 p.m., he couldn't have been shooting Officer Tippit at 1:15 p.m. And the theater was 7 blocks away from where Officer J.D. Tippit was gunned down. So it would have taken at least 10 minutes to walk or jog to the theater from there. 2 days later, Oswald, while in police custody, was shot and killed by mafia underworld figure Jack Ruby in the basement of the police station, with 60 officers watching on. Oswald was in handcuffs, and Ruby, with 60 police officers watching him, was able to pull a gun and shoot Oswald at point-blank range, as you can see here.
There is Lee Oswald. He's been shot. He's been shot. Lee Oswald has been shot. There's the man with a gun. It's absolute panic here in the basement of Dallas Police Headquarters. The detectives have their guns drawn. Oswald has been shot. There is no question about it. Oswald has been shot.
This remarkable photograph by Bob Jackson of the Dallas Times-Herald was taken a split second after the shot. Oswald, his face contorted, slumped to the floor. He was sped to the same hospital where President Kennedy died. Here's the shooting again in slow motion. Ruby, a well-known police character, burst from the crowd of newsmen and policemen and fired a single bullet at point-blank range into Oswald. Ruby was quickly subdued and later charged with murder. This after Oswald died at the hospital without regaining consciousness.
And the 60 officers who were watching this just stood there, did nothing to prevent this. And the fact that Oswald was killed by Jack Ruby, a mafia figure, caused me to assume for many decades that JFK was killed by the mafia. Now, the Warren Commission's official narrative told us that Jack Ruby was simply a nightclub owner, ran a strip club called the Carousel Club in Dallas. But Jacob Rubenstein, or Jack Ruby as he was called, was much more than that. He grew up in Chicago and had been a gun runner for Al Capone. He was heavily tied in with organized crime and rumored to be a hitman. And Jack Ruby's mob activities continued when he moved to Dallas in 1947. In fact, the Chicago mob had attempted to bribe the Dallas sheriff to take over gambling, prostitution, and other criminal activities in Dallas. And Jack Ruby was the Chicago Mafia's man in Dallas. He was running their criminal activities there.
Jack's nickname was Sparky, and he had many fights. I remember hearing of one incident from a friend of his where they were in the Glass Hat cocktail lounge of the Congress Hotel in Chicago, and he was on one side of the bar, and some man made a statement to the effect, well, when the Jews make all the money that they want, they'll call the war off. Jack went over there and hit him once and knocked him cold. He was laying on the floor.
We did a show called Sticks and Stones, but we got a bid to go back across the street at the Adolphus, and he got kind of mad at us. In fact, he was a wonderful man. He was a lot of fun and had a great personality, but he had a violent temper, and when we told him that we were going to go back across the street, he got very angry, and he hit my partner, Joe Peterson, and knocked him down the stairs and knocked out a tooth. We had no idea it was even coming. It was like he was talking to us and got very violently angry.
Jack Ruby was also a gun runner to Fidel Castro in the 1950s. Ruby was not ideological. He was involved in whatever activity paid him the most. And the Carousel Club was just a front for his crime operations, a money laundering operation. And Jack Ruby developed many close ties to the Dallas police force. And the Dallas police force was notoriously corrupt. And he hosted Dallas police officers at his club and gave them free liquor, booze, prostitutes, and so forth. And Jack Ruby was allowed to run his crime operations unharassed by the Dallas police. And I'm sure he paid many of them off. And because Jack Ruby shot and killed Lee Oswald in that Dallas police station, I'd always just assumed that JFK was murdered by the mob, because JFK had declared war on the mafia, and had installed his brother, Robert F. Kennedy, as his Attorney General. And one of RFK's jobs was to dismantle the mafia. What I didn't realize until I started studying this pretty deeply about 8 years ago is that the CIA and the mafia are partners in crime. The CIA subcontracts with the mafia to carry out its assassinations inside the United States. Now, the CIA is barred by its charter from operating inside the United States, barred by law from targeting U.S. citizens in any way. The CIA is supposed to be protecting us from foreign enemies. The CIA, of course, ignores all this, but it maintains plausible deniability by subcontracting this work, this assassinations work, out to the mafia. And that's why the mafia was allowed to engage in its organized crime activities basically unfettered for so many decades, because of its partnership with the CIA. The CIA needed the mafia for its so-called wet operations inside the United States. Wet operations are murders. And this is confirmed by Colonel Fletcher Prouty, who was the Chief of Special Operations for the Joint Chiefs of Staff during President Kennedy's administration.
I think without any question, it's what we called the use of hired gunmen. And this isn't new. In fact, this little manual here, which is called the Assassination Manual for Latin America, contains a line which says that, talking about Latin America, if possible, professional criminals will be hired to carry out specific selective jobs in quote, which means murders. Well, if this manual for Latin America, printed within the last few years, and a government manual, says that, there's no question but what the application of the same techniques was dated back in Kennedy's time. In fact, I know that from my own experience. You know, I was in that business in those days. So, with that knowledge, you begin to realize that hired criminals, the way this book says, can be hired by anybody in power with sufficient money to pay them, but more importantly, with sufficient power to operate the cover-up ever after. Because you see, there's one thing to kill somebody. It's another thing to cover up the fact that you did it or that you hired somebody to do it, and that's more difficult. So they use the device of the Warren Commission report to cover up their hired killers. Now, who would hire the killers, and who has the power to put the Warren Commission report out over the top of the whole story? You see, you're dealing with a very high echelon of power. Otherwise, how could you have gotten people like the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court to participate in the cover-up, the police in Dallas to participate in the cover-up, etc., and the media? You know, all the media, not just one or two newspapers, but none of them will print the story that other than Oswald killed the president with 3 bullets, something that's absolutely untrue.
The CIA also killed Robert F. Kennedy in 1968. Bobby Kennedy knew that the CIA had killed his brother. He also believed that then Vice President Lyndon Johnson was a co-conspirator in this assassination. And Bobby was about to win the Democrat nomination for president in 1968. He had just won the California primary. He had sewed up the nomination. And I think Bobby Kennedy was on his way to winning the presidency. I think he would have beaten Richard Nixon in 1968. And Robert Kennedy would then have wanted to do to the CIA what President John F. Kennedy planned to do, which is dismantle the CIA and start over. And Bobby Kennedy would also very likely have brought Lyndon Johnson to justice. So Bobby Kennedy was gunned down in Los Angeles in June of 1968, supposedly by a lone gunman named Sirhan. Yep, another lone gunman. Just a kook acting alone. The deep state also killed Martin Luther King Jr. And I'll be doing videos on these cases. Okay, back to Oswald. Here's another odd fact. Oswald underwent at least 12 hours of brutal police interrogation, but no notes were kept, no recordings. Isn't the most basic police procedure to take notes and to preserve those notes? Recordings of interviews with suspects were also being made by police back then, by that point in 1963. But no notes or recordings exist of many hours of police interrogation of Oswald, the most notorious accused assassin in the history of the United States, the alleged killer of the President of the United States, and the supposed killer of a Dallas police officer 45 minutes later. These facts alone tell you that something is not right. Now, I'm sure they did take notes and record these interviews. Most likely, whatever Oswald told them did not help the Warren Commission's narrative, which is that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone, and that he was this low IQ, ne'er-do-well wacko. So let's listen to what Oswald says here.
I'd like some legal representation. These police officers have not allowed me to have any. I don't know what this is all about.
Kill the president?
No, sir, I didn't. People keep asking me that. Sir?
Did you shoot the president?
I work in that building.
Were you in the building at the time?
Naturally, if I work in that building, yes, sir.
Back up, man. Did you shoot the president?
No, they're taking me in because of the fact that I lived in the Soviet Union. I'm just a patsy.
Down the hall again.
Did you find that rifle? Just dispatches you people have been given, but I emphatically deny these charges.
Oswald has hustled through a doorway. He says he has nothing against anybody. He has not committed any act of violence.
Does Oswald sound to you like he's lying? He sounds completely confident about the truth of what he's saying. As we will see, Oswald was a low-level CIA operative who had outlived his usefulness to the CIA. The CIA wanted John F. Kennedy dead, for reasons that we will see in a bit. So the CIA manipulated Lee Oswald into position to look like he was the assassin, when the truth is it was the CIA who killed JFK. And Oswald was never allowed to have legal representation, even though he repeatedly asked for a lawyer. Now consider this. 5 weeks before the killing of JFK, Oswald was hired as a part-time worker at the Texas School Book Depository building, where he would have easy access to that window on the 6th floor. Oswald was hired to work in that building on October 16, 1963. And Oswald would have a clear 265-foot shot at JFK, who would be passing by that window in Dallas at that intersection of Houston and Elm Street on November 22, 1963. But there's a problem. On the morning of the killing, the Dallas Morning News published a map that showed John F. Kennedy's motorcade route going straight down Main Street here, not down Elm Street over here. And that makes sense. The Secret Service often gives out false information to the public about the president's actual travel route as a security measure. But this means the killing of JFK was an inside job. The top level of the Secret Service would have known for weeks in advance that JFK would actually be coming down Elm Street and not down Main Street. But we're supposed to believe that Oswald, getting his job at that Texas Book Depository building 5 weeks prior to the shooting of JFK, was just a coincidence, where he would be in exactly the right position to have a clear shot at JFK. But what are the odds of that happening? 1 in many trillions, I would think.
As late as Thursday, November 21st, the newspapers in Dallas showed the route of the motorcade as it came out Main, continuing through the extension of Main, going in the middle of that big pasture they call Dealey Plaza. On Thursday evening, at the 11th hour, the route was changed by the administration of Mayor Earl Cabell. The route was changed to turn right on Houston and then left on Elm, not only going by the ambush nest where the waiting rifles were, but also going by the building in which they had pre-located the Patsy. And the indications are 3 teams at the minimum, with two teams shooting from the grassy knoll, that's 4 men, and at least 1 team in the back.
Now, the Warren Commission report is the official account of what happened. If you type questions into Google about who killed JFK or about the JFK assassination, Google will spit back answers to you from the Warren Commission report, which was released 10 months after the killing. And I'm sure YouTube will put a big fat note on my video linking to the Wikipedia article on the killing of JFK, which is a summary of the version from the Warren Commission report. And good, you should read the Warren Commission report. You should also read the report from the much better investigation that was done by the House Select Committee on Assassinations 12 years later in 1976. The reason for the 3-year House investigation from 1976 through 1979 is there were so many obvious holes, flaws, contradictions, and clear falsehoods in the Warren Commission report of 1964. Now, the House Committee on Assassinations wasn't that good either. It was also a whitewashing, but it was much better than the laughably false Warren Commission report. The House Committee on Assassinations at least concluded that more than 1 gun fired shots, which means there was a conspiracy. There's more than 1 person involved. But then the House Committee on Assassinations just stops there. Doesn't really try to answer who the second gunman might be, or what the conspiracy was. Certainly doesn't blame the CIA for anything. And in fact, there were likely more than 2 gunmen. Shots seemed to be coming in from multiple directions. The best investigation was conducted by New Orleans District Attorney Jim Garrison, who was prosecuting CIA operative Clay Shaw for his role in the CIA's killing of JFK. Shaw was a CIA operative in New Orleans, who was a key figure in the CIA's failed 1961 invasion of Cuba in the Bay of Pigs fiasco. Clay Shaw is also a key figure in Oliver Stone's movie on the JFK assassination.
But someday, somewhere, someone may find out the damn truth. We better. You, the people, the jury system sitting in judgment on Clay Shaw, represent the hope of humanity against government power.
What brought the JFK assassination under the jurisdiction of New Orleans District Attorney Jim Garrison is Oswald was from New Orleans after his return from the Soviet Union. He was living in New Orleans up until 8 weeks before the JFK assassination. And when Garrison found that out, he started looking into Oswald. Found out that he was working out of this mysterious office in the Newman Building at 544 Camp Street in New Orleans, running something called the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. That also turned out to be a covert CIA office, with notorious mobsters who were coming and going from that office. And that piqued Garrison's interest. What the hell is going on in that building? Jim Garrison wondered. Much of the material in this video comes from Jim Garrison's investigation.
Let me answer it in 2 parts, Jim, if I can. First of all, 9 years ago, this past February, I said 3 things, essentially. I said that it was apparent that the Central Intelligence Agency was extensively engaged in domestic espionage. I said, secondly, that it was apparent that the CIA was in the murder business. And I said, third, that it was also apparent that a part of the CIA was involved in the murder of President Kennedy. Now, in the last year, the CIA has admitted being extensively involved in domestic espionage. So New Orleans was an important city for the CIA. We found, as we dug into Lee Oswald's background in New Orleans, everybody connected with him, we found, ultimately, that nobody was associated with Lee Oswald who was not one way or the other connected with the intelligence structure, whether it was a contract employee of the CIA like Dave Ferry or Clay Shaw, as we know from Victor Marchetti, who brought that out last year, Richard Helms' former assistant, but all the way down to the part-time employees of the anti-Castro adventurers who were employed by the Central Intelligence Agency. So it was a case of our having bumped into so many, one after the other, that this very group of people, as we began to look at them after a year and put them in perspective with regard to their function, we began to realize we were dealing with the Central Intelligence Agency.
Then we had the House Select Committee on Assassinations in 1978 or 1976 through 1979 that produced a lot of good information, and which concluded that JFK was killed by a conspiracy and that more than one rifle were used in the assassination. And there have been hundreds of books written on the JFK assassination. I've probably read about 100 books on this topic. And I would say that 95% of the books on the JFK killing see the Warren Commission report as a cover-up, a whitewashing of what actually occurred. Some of the best books are by an attorney named Mark Lane and by a Washington Post editor and journalist named Jefferson Morley. And there are many other good books. And if the Warren Commission report had been at all convincing, we would not have a need for all these books. And had Oswald lived another day or two, we probably would have learned about Jack Ruby's role in the CIA plot to kill JFK. Jack Ruby would then die a mysterious death in his jail cell a bit more than 2 years after the killing of JFK. Yes, we're told that Jack Ruby was suddenly stricken by a super aggressive cancer that killed him within weeks just before his second trial. But Ruby was perfectly healthy a few weeks before his scheduled second trial. His second trial, he was granted a second trial that was supposed to be taking place in February of 1967. And then Ruby was suddenly attacked by this super aggressive cancer on December 9th, 1966. And 3 weeks later, he was dead. Cancer suddenly just swept through his lungs, liver, and brain. And Ruby died on January 3rd, 1967. At his second trial, Jack Ruby was expected to spill the beans on what he knew about the killing of JFK. And Ruby knew all the players in the plot. Plus, the CIA was working on developing exactly this kind of galloping cancer as a bioweapon as part of the CIA's illegal and notorious MK-Ultra program, which wasn't known by this point. But Jack Ruby knew all about MK-Ultra. And Jack Ruby believed that the CIA had injected him with this cancer-causing bioweapon. And Jack Ruby died of the exact same cancer that Clay Shaw died of, metastasized lung cancer. And remember who Clay Shaw was. He was the CIA operative, a defendant in Jim Garrison's prosecution. Jack Ruby was not a smoker, but here he is dying of lung cancer, as well as cancer of the liver and cancer of the brain, within 3 weeks of getting this cancer. And the entire 3 years Ruby was in prison, he was constantly predicting that he would be killed.
Everything pertaining to what's happening has never come to the surface. The world will never know the true facts of what occurred, my motives. The people that had so much to gain and had such an ulterior motive for putting me in a position I'm in will never let the true facts come above board to the world.
Now these people are in very high positions, Jack?
Yes.
He constantly referred to himself as a dead man walking. Also, there were many Lee Oswalds popping up. Many men calling themselves Lee Harvey Oswald kept popping up in different locations at the same time. I count 3 or 4 Lee Harvey Oswalds. Why so many Oswalds? Well, because they needed multiple Oswalds to put together the official narrative. And the problem is the CIA got sloppy. You can't have multiple Lee Oswalds popping up in different locations at the same time. And you really need to stay tuned for this entire video to the end, because this story gets more and more insane as we go. And I'm starting off actually with the least insane material, because so much of this story is stranger than fiction, impossible to make up. But every fact here is well documented. It's just ignored by the propaganda state-controlled media. And I'll tell you when I'm speculating or theorizing. I'll tell you when I'm not sure what happened or why it happened. And of course, what I'm laying out here will be called a conspiracy theory by the conspiracy deniers. But what is a conspiracy when you think about it? Well, the legal definition is two or more people getting together to plan something. That's a conspiracy. So yeah, what happened here was very definitely a conspiracy, a plot, an intricate plan by the CIA to kill JFK, and they succeeded. So count me as a proud conspiracy theorist on the JFK assassination. That there was a conspiracy to kill JFK is 100% certain. The House Select Committee on Assassinations comes to this conclusion in its report on its investigation in 1976. Also concludes that shots came from more than one rifle. And interestingly, the term conspiracy theory was popularized by the CIA and FBI to mock and ridicule anyone who questioned the official narrative. Sure, conspiracy theory was a term used before, but it was used aggressively by defenders of the official narrative of the JFK killing. And the official narrative summarized is that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. He was some unhinged wacko who was driven to kill JFK by his Marxist ideology. He had defected to Russia and was a communist, and he returned from the Soviet Union in June of 1962. He was a fanatical supporter of Fidel Castro, according to the official account. In May of 1963, 7 months before JFK's killing, Oswald even set up a chapter of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee in New Orleans, where he was the only member. That's how insane Oswald was, we're told. Basically, Lee Harvey Oswald was just a lone nutcase, a ne'er-do-well who killed JFK, says the official narrative. And the reason we're told that nightclub owner Jack Ruby killed Oswald in the basement of that police station 2 days later is because Ruby was such a fan of JFK, loved JFK so much that he suffered a mental and emotional breakdown after the killing of JFK. So when he had the opportunity, when he saw Lee Harvey Oswald just standing there in front of him, Ruby just pulled out his gun and shot Oswald at point-blank range in front of 60 police officers. That's the official version of what happened. Now move along, everyone. Nothing more to see here. And don't ask any more questions, because then you'll be a conspiracy theorist. Got it? Got it. Okay, so now let's watch the video of the assassination of President Kennedy and see if it jives at all with the official version. Now, the violence here is graphic, so you might want to take the kids away if they're watching this, or you might want to speed ahead if this is upsetting to you, because we're going to see the president's brain splattering backward. Okay, you've been warned. According to the official version, the Warren Commission version, Oswald fired 3 shots from the 6th floor window of the book depository building. 1 bullet missed. The first bullet to hit Kennedy struck him in the upper back. The second bullet struck Kennedy in the back of the head, according to the Warren Commission report. Now you can see here that Kennedy's been shot in the upper back and he slumps forward. Then we see here his head snap back as the bullet hits his head from the front. Can you see that? Head clearly hit by bullet from the front, then snaps back. The problem with this is that Oswald was supposedly shooting from the rear. If Oswald is the only shooter, Kennedy could not have been struck in the front of the head. And this film we're watching here is often called the Zapruder film. It's an 8mm home movie taken by a spectator named Abraham Zapruder. It's the best film and clearest footage we have of the killing, better than anything that came from the TV that day. And this film would not be available to the public until 12 years later, when it was first aired by ABC News on March 6, 1975. We're told that it was kept hidden because it was just too graphic and upsetting for public consumption. And we're also told that this film does not amount to evidence. Doesn't amount to evidence? This film blows to pieces the Warren Commission's report that claims that President Kennedy was shot in the back of the head. Now, conspiracy deniers say that Kennedy's head snapping back was caused by recoil. But here we see wife Jacqueline Kennedy, trying to gather up brain matter on the back of the car in the trunk area. And we have brain, blood, and Kennedy's skull being sprayed backwards onto people, not forwards. So you can either believe the official account by the Warren Commission report, or you can believe your own lying eyes. And we also have a bullet hole in the windshield of the car that Kennedy was riding in.
We ran around the side of the building to the emergency room exit, and the presidential limousine was there. Had been standing there for some time just watching the back of the emergency room when I realized that there was a bullet hole in the windshield. Talked to my friend next to me and said, "Look, there's a bullet hole in the windshield," and pointed it out to them. At the time, I did not know any of the details of the shooting. I was quite shocked when I looked up and saw the bullet hole, but it was very clear. It was a through and through bullet hole through the windshield of the car from the front to the back. It seemed like a high velocity bullet that had penetrated from front to back in that glass pane. At which point a security officer of some type raced forward and jumped in the limousine and drove it off even as I was leaning against it to an area back of us somewhere. And that was the last time I saw the limousine.
There was also clearly bullet damage to the chrome on JFK's car. But the Secret Service quickly took possession of JFK's limo and blocked people from having access to the car. JFK's limo was quickly flown to Washington, D.C., then to Cincinnati to have the windshield replaced, then to a Ford plant in Dearborn, Michigan to have the interior completely torn out, and the body of the limo refurbished, including all the bullet damage to the chrome, so the car looked like new. Okay, so much for the theory that JFK was shot in the back of the head by Lee Oswald. He was shot in the front of the head, most likely from this grassy knoll area right here, from behind this picket fence, which is right next to the triple underpass. Plus, at least 65 witnesses report hearing shots from the top of the grassy knoll and saw puffs of smoke from these gunshots. Here are a few of them.
And just as he started to turn and look at me, and his hand came up, I thought to wave, and all of a sudden the shots rang out and he grabbed his throat. And it was just horrible. There was a series of shots, and I saw this flash of light and the puff of smoke from the knoll in front of us.
Where, by the way, the Warren Commission says nothing ever took place.
Oh, I saw it.
You saw that puff of smoke.
Oh, I did.
You know something happened at the
knoll.
knoll.
Someone was shooting from there.
May I have your name, please, sir?
Bill Newman.
Billy, tell me what you saw and what you felt. What happened to you?
We just come from left field after seeing the president and the first lady, and we were just in front of the triple underpass on Elm Street, and we're at the edge of the curve, getting ready to wave at the president. But the president's car was some 50 feet still yet. In front of us, coming towards us, and we heard the first shot. And then as the car got directly in front of us, well, a gunshot apparently from behind us hit the president in the side of the temple.
Do you think the first gunshot came from behind you too?
I think it came from the same location. Apparently back up on the mall. I don't know what you call it.
Do you think the shot came from up on top of the viaduct toward the president? Is that correct?
Yes, sir. Not on the viaduct itself, but up on top of the hill, a little mound of ground there, the garden.
I'm convinced, and no one will ever convince me any differently, that the shots came from the area of the picket fence on the grassy knoll. No one will ever convince me. I saw it. I believe that's where it came from. And the only way that I'm ever going to believe any different is when I stand before the judge on the judgment day and he tells me. But I know what I saw, and that's what I saw.
The headshot seemed to come from the right front. It seemed to strike him here, and his head went back, and all of the brain matter went out the back of the head. It was like a red halo, a red circle with bright matter in the middle of it. It just went like that. It was a terrible time. You cannot imagine seeing this. You knew it happened, but you didn't want to believe it.
The particular headshot must have come from another direction besides behind him, because the back of his head blew off, and it doesn't make sense to be hit from the rear and still have your face intact. So he must have been hit from another position, possibly, in the front or over to the side. I really don't know where. But the back of his head blew off.
So I am very dead certain at least one shot, include the one that took the president's skull off, had to come from the right front. And I'll stand by that to my death.
Some of the Secret Service agents thought the gunfire was from an automatic weapon fired to the right rear of the president's car, probably from a grassy knoll to which the police rushed. And that was confirmed a few minutes ago by Mr. and Mrs. Nunley, who were eyewitnesses to this event.
And what was your position with the railroad company?
Track and signal supervisor for the Union Terminal Railroad. I've put in 41 years of railroad service in the signal department.
Did you look in any particular direction when you heard the shots?
Yes, I looked over to where I thought the shot came from, and I saw a puff of smoke still lingering underneath the trees in front of the wooden fence. The report sounded like it came from behind the wooden fence. And a policeman throwed his motorcycle down in the middle of the street and run up the embankment with his pistol drawn. He was running toward that particular spot. And also another motorcycle policeman right behind him tried to ride up the embankment on his motorcycle, and it turned over about halfway up the embankment. And he got out, got off his motorcycle and left it laying there and run on over to the fence with his gun in his hand.
Where do you think the shots came from?
Well, I know where that third shot came from.
Where did that shot come from?
Behind the picket fence.
Is there any
close to the little plaza?
Is there any doubt in your mind that that shot came from behind the
There's
fence?
no doubt in my mind. There's no doubt whatsoever in my mind in the statement that I made in the sheriff's office immediately after the shooting, and the statement that I made to the Warren Commission. And I made it very plain there was no doubt in my mind. But there was definitely a shot fired from behind that picket fence. I made it plain to the Warren Commission, and I think I made the same statement in the sheriff's office. There was a fourth shot.
On November 22nd, Mr. Holland, did you tell the sheriff's office in an affidavit you signed that date that you saw a puff of smoke come from behind the picket fence?
I am certain I did.
Was it the general feeling, would you say, Mr. Holland, among the police officers and others, at the moment that the shots were fired, that at least one shot came from behind that wooden fence?
There's about 6 or 8 of us boys from the Union Terminal run around there to find some evidence that there was someone around there. Certainly the ones that was with me that run around that fence realized what was happening. They told me the same thing that I told you, that there was definitely a shot fired, and they saw the smoke. We just all started running around that fence as a unit.
The vast majority of the witnesses who expressed an opinion as to the origin of the shots agreed with Mr. Holland.
Here's what J.C. Price has to say. He's sitting in a different location, on the roof of the Terminal Annex building. He hears shots from the grassy knoll area by the overpass, and he saw a suspicious man running away behind the wooden fence and past the cars in the parking lot.
Right here?
Right here on this spot.
And where did you think you heard the shots come from?
From behind the overpass over there, triple overpass. That's where I thought the shots were coming from.
And where did you see the man run?
Over behind that wooden fence, past the cars, and over behind the Texas Depository building.
Did you give that information to the Dallas Sheriff's Department on the very day of the assassination?
Yes, I did. I'd say in about 30 minutes after the assassination.
Were you ever called as a witness by the Warren Commission?
No, sir. No, sir.
And here's what real estate developer Lee Bowers had to say about what he saw behind the picket fence. He testified before the Warren Commission about this, but he says the Warren Commission counsel cut him off in the middle of his testimony.
Your present occupation?
I'm Vice President of Lockwood Meadows Incorporated, which is a real estate land development company.
And where were you at about 12:30 that day?
I was at the south end of the terminal of the tower building, rather looking down toward the terminal and observing the motorcade, as was everyone else in the area.
Could you tell us what you heard and what you saw from about 12 noon until the time that the shots were fired?
Well, for some time that morning, since perhaps 10 o'clock in the morning, we had had the area pretty well sealed off, and the policemen had been stationed on the triple underpass as well as other strategic corners in the area, so that there was very little traffic moving into this area at this time. However, about 12:10, give or take 5 minutes, there was a car which entered the area and probed around for some time. This car was a 59 Oldsmobile station wagon with a out-of-state license. It was muddy as if it had just come in off of the road from some area where it was a red sandy area. It was occupied by one male who spent 3 or 4 minutes in the area looking it over, and then as he found out, left by the entrance, which is the only way in and out of the area at that time. Not too long after that, perhaps 5 or 6 minutes, a car of a totally different description, also occupied by one male, entered the area. Now, this man performed a similar action, and he toured down around the area, probing to examine the exits, and seemed at one or more occasions to have a mic or something resembling such an instrument up to his face. Just a few moments after that, the third car came into the area, and these were the only 3 cars that entered this area during this specific period. The third car was a 61 or 2 Chevrolet. This car was muddy all the way up to the windows as if it had just come in off the road. It had an out-of-state license identical to the first car of the series. This car was occupied by one male who spent a little bit more time in the area than the others, and probed down by the side of the tower where I was located. Immediately after the shots were fired, of course, was mass confusion, to put it mildly. But the area was immediately sealed off by, I would say, at least 50 police within 3 to 5 minutes. The first one to appear on the scene, other than those, of course, who were standing around, including 2 on top of the triple underpass, was one who rode a motorcycle up the incline coming up from the lower portion of Elm Street. And he rode perhaps 2/3 of the way up or more before he deserted his motorcycle. At the time of the shooting, in the vicinity of where the 2 men I've described were, there was a flash of light, there was something which occurred which caught my eye in this immediate area on the embankment. And what this was, I could not state at that time, and at this time I could not identify it, other than there was some unusual occurrence, a flash of light or smoke or something which caused me to feel like something out of the ordinary had occurred there.
In reading your testimony, Mr. Bowers, it appears that just as you were about to make that statement, you were interrupted in the middle of the sentence by the commission counsel, who then went into another area.
Well, that's correct. I was there only to tell them what they asked, and so that when they seemed to want to cut off the conversation, I felt like that was, as far as I was concerned, that was the end of it.
Lee Bowers then ends up dead in a car accident 2.5 years after JFK's assassination. An eyewitness reports that Bowers was driven off the road to his death by another car. And maybe the best witness to the Grassy Knoll shooter and the shooter's accomplice was Ed Hoffman, who is deaf and mute, so he uses sign language to communicate.
I parked my car here. I realized at this spot that I would be able to see Kennedy pass close by. I stood here and waited, and I was looking towards where he would be coming from. I suddenly saw two men who looked suspicious directly over there in the car park. I saw a man standing here, wearing a black hat and a blue jacket. I saw a puff of smoke, and I thought it was a cigarette, but it wasn't. He had a gun, and he walked towards the railroad. He tossed the gun to the second man. Then he turned and straightened his jacket, adjusted his hat, and walked casually away. When the motorcade passed by below me here, I realized that Kennedy had been shot. I was horrified. I saw a policeman standing on the railroad bridge, and I tried to get his attention, but he didn't see me. So I got in my car and drove to the area where I had seen the two men. But there were so many people there, and I couldn't find them. I went to the FBI to tell them what I had seen. They didn't want me to say anything. It was hard for me to communicate with them. I do feel that the two men I saw were working together, and that the one with the gun behind the fence was the man who shot President Kennedy.
Bullets appear to have come from many angles and many locations. The CIA appears to have had snipers positioned all around. More on this later. Also, JFK's brain went missing. And not just brain matter or part of the brain missing from the gunshot spraying brain matter everywhere. His entire brain is gone. JFK was buried without his brain.
Even more questionable than the presence of military doctors is the fact that during this autopsy, President Kennedy's brain was actually removed from his head and placed in a collection of evidence labeled simply Item Number 9.
Item number 9 was a stainless steel bucket that was about 7 inches high, 8.5 inches in diameter, that contained President Kennedy's brain. And so there's something very unusual about the way the whole thing was handled.
JFK's brain was removed during the autopsy and stored in the National Archives. And 3 years after the autopsy, his brain went missing from the National Archives. And the theory as to why the brain went missing, why his brain vanished, is because it was so obvious to anyone looking at it that the bullet did not enter through the back of the head. And JFK's brain has never been found. In fact, all of the autopsy materials that were originally stored with JFK's brain went missing as well, never to be found. And government records document that JFK was buried without his brain. In fact, let's take a moment to review the strange autopsy that was conducted, or I should say, the autopsy that was not conducted. The first surgeon to see JFK's body was Dr. Charles Crenshaw of Parkland Memorial Hospital in Dallas. Dr. Crenshaw and all the other doctors in the ER room say that there was no doubt that the bullet entered Kennedy's head from the front.
Did the shot come from behind Kennedy or from the front? Remember, the Warren Commission investigation concluded the shots came only from behind. Dr. Crenshaw says they're wrong.
The bullet struck about where and passed about where?
From here,
right, through. And taking out
the back or the occipital part, the back of your head. This was gone, in our view, and that's the reason we could see the cerebellum.
Had the bullet come from the back, what would have been the difference?
It would have been much different. It would have gone a little more anterior and be a bigger blaster.
Right.
And here's what Dr. Paul Peters says he saw minutes after the president was shot.
I could see that he had a large, about 7 centimeter opening in the right occipital-parietal area. A considerable portion of the brain was missing there, and the occipital cortex, the back portion of the brain, was lying down near the opening of the wound, and blood was trickling out.
Here's what Dr. McClellan said.
Almost a fifth or perhaps even a quarter of the right back part of the head in this area here had been blasted out, along with probably most of the brain tissue.
Dr. Crenshaw also believes that there were many shooters.
Doctor, the president we know was shot, passing on the road in his motorcade down below, and the official version has Lee Harvey Oswald firing from behind. From what you say and what you're describing, he was shot from the front.
That's correct.
Meaning there had to be two gunmen.
At least one, and maybe two more.
And you believe that?
I'll always believe that, because of the wounds that I observed at Parkland Hospital.
And Dr. Crenshaw says that Kennedy's shot in the throat also came from the front, not from the back, and that a wider cut was made over the bullet wound in the throat, the purpose being to disguise the bullet wound. Dr. Crenshaw says that the wound was tampered with to obscure the fact that the wound in the throat was a clean, round bullet hole, which would mean that the bullet entered Kennedy's throat from the front. And that could correspond to the bullet hole that we saw in the windshield that was clearly coming through the front of the windshield.
The second wound?
The second wound was here in the throat, right above the necktie. It was a small opening, very small, 3 to 5 millimeters, about the size of your little finger.
In a slow-motion study of the film, President Kennedy grabs his throat with both hands, reacting, Crenshaw believes, as if he is shot from the front. At first, most of the doctors working on the president believed the small neck wound they observed to be an entry wound from the front. But a later autopsy from Bethesda Naval Hospital showed another previously undetected wound in the back, which the Dallas medical team had not found.
But the Secret Service suddenly rushed in and took custody of Kennedy's body, which is a violation of protocol. In a murder case, the coroner is supposed to examine the body first. The coroner here being Dr. Earl Rose. But the Secret Service forcefully pushed Dr. Rose and all the other doctors aside and grabbed Kennedy's body and took it out. And Dr. Rose protested, telling the Secret Service that this is a violation of protocol. The chain of evidence must be maintained in any murder investigation, even more so with the killing of the President of the United States. And Dr. Rose insisted to the Secret Service that the President's body could not leave the hospital before the autopsy. But Dr. Rose, the coroner, the official medical examiner, was ignored. He was pushed aside and told to shut up about all this. And here's what Dr. Paul Peters says he saw.
Dr. Earl Rose was a forensic pathologist, well trained in medical legal autopsies, and he appeared at Trauma 1 and said, this is a homicide in Dallas County, and I will do the autopsy on President Kennedy. In the meantime, a casket had been acquired and the president's body had been placed in it, and he was informed by the Secret Service that if he didn't get out of the way, he would be run over by the casket as they were leaving. This was the President of the United States, and they were taking him back to Washington.
And all the doctors there were told to maintain strict silence. And all these witnesses, all these doctors and surgeons who saw the president minutes after he was shot there at the Dallas hospital say that the bullet that struck the president's head came from the front, not from the back. And this becomes a big problem for the official narrative, which is that only 3 shots were fired, and that they all came from Oswald, which would have to be from the rear. The book depository building was behind the president. Then the Secret Service rushed JFK's body from the Dallas hospital to Bethesda Naval Hospital in Bethesda, Maryland. Here's what witnesses in Bethesda say they saw. Here's medical technician Paul O'Connor.
The morgue door burst open and 6 or 7 men came carrying this casket in and set it on the floor next to the table, autopsy table. As I remember, this casket was a type of casket that was a cheap shipping type of casket. What I mean by a shipping casket is that it's not a very ornamental casket. It's not very expensive. It's a very plain casket.
This was obviously not the kind of casket that the president was put in Dallas. In Dallas, he was put in a nice ornamental casket, appropriate for a president.
It was a expensive bronze color type. It was a bronze casket. One of the most expensive that we had in stock.
The casket was opened, and inside was a slate gray rubber body bag with a zipper that ran from the head all the way down to the toes. We unzipped the body bag, and inside was the body of the president. We put the body on the table. He was nude, no clothes on, but he had a bloody white sheet wrapped around his face and his head.
And a bloody white sheet was wrapped around the president's head so that you couldn't see his head. Why is this? Well, because the president's head had been surgically altered, had been closed up. The official autopsy photos from Bethesda Navy Hospital showed the wound closed up. Photography experts also tell us that the photos have been altered. Essentially, a primitive version of Photoshop was used on the official autopsy photos of the back of the president's head. The autopsy photos have been faked.
The autopsy photographs show a massive wound, but it's in the right temporal area and into the parietal area, which is behind it, between the two. It is inconceivable to me that every single one of the witnesses who saw the president's head could be wrong, and specifically wrong, about this particular wound. They describe an avulsed, exploded open wound in the rear of the head. In the autopsy photographs, you see a small, neat wound of entrance. It's obvious to me that those photographs have been faked.
When I first saw the pictures of the president's body, so-called wounds, what really struck me was especially the head wound. They showed a nice little neat round bullet hole in the back of his head. When actually what I saw was the whole side of his head blown off. It was gone. I don't know where those things came from, but they're totally wrong. Every one of them.
And the Warren Commission did not deal with the autopsy photos at all. The Warren Commission only looked at drawings of the bullet wounds, even though photos were readily available. The Warren Commission did not actually want to look at any evidence or talk to any witnesses who would contradict the official narrative, the official story that the Warren Commission wanted to put out. And the Warren Commission operated entirely behind closed doors, out of public view. Interviews of witnesses were in secret. 13 years later, the House Committee on Assassinations did have the photos and did look at them, but did not call in the doctors from Dallas who had seen the president minutes after he was shot. So the House Committee on Assassinations was also a whitewashing, a cover-up of what happened, just not as blatant a cover-up as the Warren Commission. Dr. Charles Crenshaw would later write a book titled Conspiracy of Silence, published in 1992. Where he says that he and doctors in Dallas were pressured by Allen Dulles and the CIA, as well as the FBI, to change their story about what they initially saw. Allen Dulles was the longtime former CIA director who had been fired by JFK. And this would be the very same Allen Dulles who would lead the Warren Commission investigation into the murder. Allen Dulles and JFK despised each other. So Allen Dulles, the one who should be being investigated, was leading the Warren Commission investigation. Got it? And more on Allen Dulles in a bit, and the war between JFK and Allen Dulles. But here's where it gets weird. In Bethesda Navy Hospital, Lieutenant William Bruce Pitzer, who was head of the hospital's audiovisual department, happened to get a film of the autopsy in Bethesda. He saw everything and captured it on film. Pitzer said, "We all know what we saw. The bullet hit President Kennedy's head from the front, not the back." And first-class Navy Corpsman Dennis David saw Pitzer working on the film. He also saw the film and agreed with Pitzer. The bullet had hit JFK in the front of the head, not the back of the head. With this film, Pitzer had the most explosive, hard evidence yet that Oswald did not shoot JFK. Absolute proof that the bullet came through the front of JFK's head. So on October 29, 1966, Pitzer was found dead on the floor in a pool of blood. A .38 caliber pistol was found next to his body. Pitzer's death was of course ruled a suicide. Pitzer's wife, Joyce, said that there was no way that this was a suicide. Her husband was not depressed at all. And of course this film disappeared when Pitzer died, though his wife Joyce had seen the film. And an intelligence agent did pay a visit to Joyce and warned her not to speak about any of this. She kept quiet for 25 years. And even when she was in her 80s, she worried that she would lose her pension. Okay, let's review some more about why Lee Oswald could not have fired any of the shots that killed JFK. Kennedy was shot at 12:30 p.m. The big clock on the top of the book depository building had just changed from 12:29 to 12:30 when shots rang out. But at 12:20, a witness, Carolyn Arnold, saw Oswald on the first floor calmly eating lunch. Carolyn Arnold was a secretary working in the building who happened to be pregnant, and she remembers seeing Oswald eating lunch at 12:20 because she always eats lunch at that time. And she checked her watch before she got up to get her lunch in the canteen. So there's Oswald chillin', eating lunch, looking like he doesn't have a concern in the world. At 12:20, the president would be shot 10 minutes later. And so we're supposed to believe that Oswald would soon be running up the stairs from the first floor to the sixth floor and shooting at the president from a sixth-floor window just 10 minutes later. Oswald also named two other people in the lunchroom at that time, one guy named Junior and another guy Oswald did not know his name. These were two black guys who worked in the building. And there were actually two lunchrooms, one on the first floor for the black workers and one on the second floor, a nicer lunch area for the white folks. And the lunchroom on the second floor had vending machines. Oswald always ate his lunch in the lunchroom on the first floor with the black workers. Texas was very racist in those days. Oswald then walked up to the second floor to get a Coca-Cola. A woman named R.A. Reed saw Oswald on the second floor. In fact, he got change for his dollar from Mrs. Reed so he could have the right coins to put in the Coke machine. Then shots rang out at 12:30, and a motorcycle officer named Marion Baker, who was part of the motorcade, heard the shots, jumped off his motorcycle, and ran into the building. He ran up the stairs, and he bumped into Roy Truly in the stairwell. Both Roy Truly and Officer Baker see Oswald on the second floor, in the snack area, calmly standing there, drinking his Coca-Cola. Officer Baker points his gun at Oswald. Officer Baker asks Roy Truly if he knows Oswald. Truly was the building manager, and Truly answers yes, he works here in the depository. And that satisfied Officer Baker, who then kept heading up the stairs to the sixth floor.
I heard those shots come off, and they seemed like they was high, and they were directly ahead of me. And as I tried to figure out where they came from, and the building that I had in mind was directly ahead of me, and that was the Texas Book Depository, standing around there where the stairs or elevator was. And there was a man who spoke up and said he was the building manager and he'd show me.
I realized that he didn't know the layout of the building, so I ran in with him. It was just a matter of seconds after the third shot, and we ran across the shipping room floor, stopped at the elevators.
And we couldn't get that service elevator working, and he said, well, we use the stairs. And he turned around and immediately went up the stairs.
We ran on up the first flight to the second floor, and the officer looked in the snack bar adjacent to our office.
And I kind of looked off to the right over there through a doorway and saw an image of a man walking away through that doorway. And when I got to the doorway, he was on down there a little bit, and I hollered at him and asked him to come back.
The officer with me had a gun in his hand, and he threw the gun toward the middle of Oswald, and he looked probably a little startled, like anybody else would if you just put a gun in his stomach all at once, which I thought was natural.
I turned around and asked him if the man worked for him, and if he knew him. And he said, yes, said he works for me, and I know him. And at that time, the man never did say anything. I never did say anything further to him. I turned around and went on up the stairs to the third
time
floor.
it took you to get into the building and go up the stairs, and the time when you first saw Lee Harvey Oswald.
I believe, excuse me, from the time that I heard those shots and time I ran into that building, entered the lobby, and made it up to the second floor, it was approximately a minute and a half to 2 minutes.
At that time, no one seemed to see Lee Oswald as the least bit suspicious. Oswald worked there and was drinking his Coca-Cola on the second floor 95 seconds after Kennedy was shot. according to Officer Baker and according to Roy Truly. And the Warren Commission report acknowledges that there are only 95 seconds of unaccounted for time for Lee Oswald. The Warren Commission then goes through a lot of mental gymnastics to argue that it would be possible to Oswald to have killed Kennedy during this 95-second window of unaccounted for time. Also, the service elevator wasn't working, so Oswald would have had to have run up from the 2nd floor to the 6th floor, gotten his rifle, gotten into position at exactly the right time when the president was passing by, fired 3 shots, 2 of them accurately, wiped down the rifle of fingerprints, then find a place to hide the rifle, then stuff the rifle behind boxes of books in an attempt to hide the rifle 120 feet from the window where he supposedly shot the president from, and then run back to the 2nd floor snack area to resume calmly drinking his Coca-Cola. You'd have to do all that in 95 seconds. And is that how you'd be behaving if you had just shot the president of the United States? I mean, Usain Bolt could not have done this in 95 seconds. Plus, on the 6th floor, there were stacks of books in a big open floor layout. This was a school book depository for the state of Texas. So he would have had to get around all these boxes of books to make it across the floor to the window. And the rifle he supposedly used was found wedged behind boxes. And there were no usable fingerprints on the rifle.
The fingerprints on the boxes added up to the fingerprints of a large number of policemen, one unidentified man, and no fingerprints of Lee Oswald.
So Oswald supposedly fires off 3 shots. Let's hear this witness, Lee Bowers, describe the shots that he heard.
Mr. Bowers, how many shots did you hear?
There were 3 shots, and these were spaced with 1 shot, then a pause, and then 2 shots in very close order, such as perhaps almost on top of each other, while there was some pause between the first and the second shots.
Did you tell that to the Dallas police?
Yes, I told this to the police, and then also told it to the FBI, and also I had a discussion 2 or 3 days later with them concerning this, and they made no comment, other than the fact that when I stated I felt like the 2nd and 3rd shots could not have been fired from the same rifle, they reminded me that I wasn't an expert, and I had to agree.
Now, this is physically impossible for a bolt-action rifle. This is not an automatic or semi-automatic weapon where you can squeeze off many rapid shots in succession. This is a World War II Italian-made Carsano Model 38 rifle, and it was poorly sighted. The sight was misaligned. You have to reload the chamber by pulling back this bolt, and then re-sight it, and that takes time. And you'd have to fire off 3 shots in 6 seconds with this type of rifle. It can't be done. In fact, CBS News hired 19 sharpshooters to try to get 3 shots off in 6 seconds with this type of bolt-action rifle. 18 could not do it, and one guy sort of did it, but his rifle was locked into position on a tripod. Oswald had no tripod, which would make it much more difficult to hit a moving target 265 feet away. And of course, this would be a very high-pressure situation. Oswald would have had to have done this calmly, rapidly, and hit that target with 2 out of 3 shots from 265 feet away with a misaligned sight, with no tripod to keep his rifle steady, with Kennedy's car moving at 15 to 20 miles per hour. Also, the president's motorcade was 6 minutes late to the location. Oswald was eating lunch 10 minutes before that on the 1st floor, according to Carolyn Arnold. So that gives Oswald 4 minutes to get into position 6 flights up a stairs, if the president had been coming through on schedule. And it's actually 12 flights of stairs up because there's a big landing area between the floors of stairs. This is a big building, and the doors to the stairwell are thick metal doors. These doors are heavy. Plus, Oswald was tested as a very poor marksman in the Marines. He met the bare minimum standard for passing his marksmanship exam. If Oswald had actually made it to trial, this scenario would have just been laughed out of court, which is why Oswald had to be killed.
Mrs. Walter says that she saw 2 men with a gun in the book depository.
I looked at this building and I saw this man with the gun, and there was another man standing to his right, and I could not see all of this man, and I couldn't see his face. And the other man was holding a short gun. It wasn't as long as a rifle.
It should be noted here that the commission failed to follow up Mrs. Walther's story. She was interviewed briefly by FBI agents, but never called before the commission or its staff.
Also, when the rifle was first reported found by Officer Seymour Weitzman, he says the gun is a German Mauser. Here's his affidavit here, saying it was a bolt-action German Mauser. And in fact, that's what Walter Cronkite reports on the night of the assassination, that they had found a German Mauser on the 6th floor. And Officer Seymour Weitzman would know what he saw because he owned a sporting goods store on the side, which sold these kinds of rifles.
Just before Oswald's arrest, 2 different rifles had been found on the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository. Patrolman Roger Craig and Seymour Weitzman had discovered a 7.65 Mauser.
We weren't any more than 6 or 8 inches from the rifle, and stamped right on the barrel of the rifle was 7.65 Mauser.
The other rifle found was a 6.5 Mannlicher Carcano. Roger Craig was also one of the first policemen to find the spent shells from the Mannlicher Carcano, Oswald's rifle, which to him had landed in a very unusual manner after firing.
Deputy Sheriff Luke Mooney was with me when we found the shells. We found 3 hulls beside the window on the 6th floor. They were lying 3 in a row, not more than an inch apart, all pointing in the same direction.
Also, the rifle that Oswald supposedly ordered through the mail and that was shown originally looks nothing like the Oswald rifle used as evidence by the Warren Commission, and that's in the National Archives. This most recent gun used by the Warren Commission is much shorter. It looks like a pea shooter compared to the original Oswald gun that was displayed on November 22nd. You can just look at the rifle that was found and shown to the public initially, and the Oswald rifle that they have in the National Archives, and see that they're different rifles. They look nothing alike.
And the paraffin test would show whether or not you fired a rifle. The results were available before the end of the day. They showed that Oswald had not fired a rifle.
We also have a photo of what appears to be Lee Harvey Oswald right here. As the first shots were fired at JFK, we have a photo of Oswald, Lee Oswald, standing right here on the 1st floor. This photo was taken by Associated Press photographer James Alton. If Oswald was here, he could not have been on the 6th floor firing shots. The FBI says this is a photo of a man named Billy Lovelady. You decide. Was this a photo of Oswald or Lovelady?
Oswald was not involved in any way. As a matter of fact, he was standing on the 1st floor watching the parade.
Okay, so who was Lee Harvey Oswald? Lee Harvey Oswald was born in New Orleans in 1939. His father died of a heart attack 2 months before he was born, so his mom struggled financially. The official account portrays Oswald as a weird loner, an oddball. But Lee Oswald was elected class president in middle school. He was popular and outgoing, not a loner, not weird. Also, the media keeps calling Lee Oswald Lee Harvey Oswald with the middle name to make him sound extra sinister. But no one called him that. He was just Lee Oswald. Lee Oswald joined the U.S. Marines at the age of 17. His older brother Robert was also a Marine. Lee Oswald was a terrible shot. Even after extensive Marine Corps training, his marksmanship score was 191. To be considered a marksman, you have to score at least 264, and a sharpshooter requires a score of between 324 and 400. Lee Oswald scored 191. But Oswald was intelligent. He had a facility with languages. He was put in a language program and became fluent in Russian, which is a difficult language to learn. In 1957, Oswald was stationed at the Atsugi Naval Base in Japan, where he was a radar operator and worked on the very top secret U-2 spy planes. The U-2 spy planes could fly at altitudes of 70,000 feet and take photos of Russia's and China's military installations. Oswald is portrayed as a nobody in the official account, but Lee Oswald was far from a nobody. Oswald had crypto security clearance because he was working with the U-2 spy planes, and he had access to the information that was being collected by the U-2 spy planes. This means that Lee Oswald had the highest level of top secret security clearance. Oswald listened to radio communications from the U-2 spy plane. And Oswald certainly would have known a lot about the U-2 spy plane that would have been of great interest to the Soviet Union. The Atsugi naval base in Japan was a crucial CIA base of operations, was in fact the CIA's headquarters for that part of the world. This CIA base of operations was run by CIA officer Richard Bissell, who reported directly to then CIA Director Allen Dulles. Curiously, when Oswald's superiors at the Atsugi Naval Base testified to the Warren Commission, they were never asked about Oswald's work on the U-2 spy plane and all the information he had access to because of Oswald's ultra-top secret crypto security clearance. You don't get a crypto security clearance if you're a nobody. But the Warren Commission had no interest in this information, seemed to try to hide this information, because the official narrative was that Oswald was a ne'er-do-well nobody. So the Warren Commission never uttered a word about Oswald's crypto top-secret security clearance or his work on the U-2 spy plane. Something else the Warren Commission never asked about and never mentioned. At this Atsugi naval base, U.S. soldiers were subjected to the CIA's illegal and secret MK-Ultra mind control experiments. MK-Ultra used combinations of drugs, hypnosis, and mind control brainwashing techniques to transform humans into weapons who could be programmed to kill on command and have no memory of the killing, similar to what we see in the 1964 movie The Manchurian Candidate.
Captain Marco, you be good enough to lend Raymond your pistol, please. Shoot Bobby, Raymond.
But these MK-Ultra mind control drugs and techniques can also be used to program people for other tasks, not just killing people. It was while Oswald was at the Atsugi naval base in Japan and while he was working on the U-2 spy plane that Oswald was recruited by the CIA. And he defected to Russia in October of 1959 as part of the CIA's fake defector program. That's right, the CIA had a fake defector program. There were some 40 participants in the CIA's fake defector program, including Lee Harvey Oswald. And those in the CIA's fake defector program were subjected to MK-Ultra mind control techniques. So they could be programmed to sound and behave like communists, and so they would be convincing to the Soviets. To be trained as a fake defector, the Navy sent Oswald to undertake what was called illusory warfare training at a facility in Nags Head, North Carolina. This is where spies went to learn how to be effective spies. Now, the Russians almost certainly knew that Oswald was a fake defector. They're not idiots. They had their own fake defector program. And the Soviets gave a very nice job to Oswald at the Minsk radio factory in Minsk, Belarus. They also gave him a nice apartment overlooking the Svizloch River. And when I say nice, I mean by Russian standards of that day. 99% of Russians would have loved Oswald's job and apartment, would have loved Oswald's life in Russia. So the Soviets were rolling out the red carpet for Lee Oswald. And Oswald met his wife, Marina, while in Minsk in the spring of 1961, Marina Prushakova. They were married at the home of her uncle, who worked for the Soviet KGB. The official account is that Oswald decided to return to the United States because he got disillusioned with life in the Soviet Union. And Oswald brought his wife, Marina, back with him to the United States. And they lived in New Orleans before moving to the Dallas-Fort Worth area about 8 weeks before the assassination attempt on JFK. The Soviet Union would not have allowed Marina to just exit the Soviet Union with Oswald, an obvious spy, unless she herself was a spy. And her uncle was KGB, so she was almost certainly KGB as well. And we're supposed to believe that the U.S. government had no problem with this. A U.S. Navy intelligence defector to the Soviet Union who had crypto top-secret security clearance with deep knowledge of America's top-secret U-2 spy plane who returns to the United States with an obvious KGB agent as his wife, but no problem for Oswald to get back into the United States. In fact, the red carpet was rolled out for Oswald by the U.S. government. You'd think he'd be tried for treason. He was given a U.S. passport and even a loan to help him get a place to live and reestablished in the United States. Every obstacle was removed for Oswald to return to the United States. If Oswald were not a CIA operative, he certainly would have been tried for treason. The only possible reason Oswald was not tried for treason is he was a spy for the United States. And indeed, documents show that the CIA had an extensive 201 file on Oswald, which means that he was a CIA operative. Oswald's 201 CIA file was uncovered by Senator Frank Church in his special Senate committee investigation into the activities of the CIA in the early 1970s, which exposed the CIA's MK Ultra program, Operation Chaos, Operation COINTELPRO, Operation Mockingbird, Operation Paperclip, and on and on and on. Here's Senator Frank Church showing a gun used by the CIA to shoot poisoned darts into people. Darts the target wouldn't notice. The target just keels over from a heart attack. And the man running the CIA's Assassinations program from 1954 to 1967 was this beaut right here, James Jesus Angleton. Angleton, a Yale graduate, ran the CIA's Assassinations program with Army Lieutenant Colonel Boris Pash. Pash was primarily in charge of the CIA's so-called wet operations, which were assassinations. The Church Committee hearings, the Church Committee investigation found that Angleton had this 201 file on Oswald 3 years before JFK was killed. And this 201 file is not just a file folder full of material. Oswald's CIA 201 file was 7 volumes. Not only does Oswald's 201 file prove that Oswald was a CIA operative, it also proves that the CIA believed he had to be watched closely. However, the Church Committee also found that the CIA sometimes, or actually often, created fake 201 files on CIA assets they intend to set up as fall guys in assassinations. They could say, look, we already suspected that this agent was up to no good, and then place the blame on him. This was part of the CIA's ZR Rifle Project, which was related to the CIA's assassinations of political leaders. Lee Oswald's former roommate and fellow Marine, James Bothello, testified that Oswald was not a communist or a Marxist. That was just a front, Bothello said. Bothello said that Oswald was actually strongly anti-communist. He said that he was always certain that Oswald was functioning in Russia as an undercover intelligence agent. When Oswald returned to the United States, his CIA handler was a 51-year-old Russian émigré named George de Mohrenschildt. And de Mohrenschildt would end up dead on March 29, 1977, with a shotgun blast to the head just a few days before he was supposed to testify to the House Committee on Assassinations about his knowledge of the CIA plot to kill JFK. On October 15, 1967, Dutch investigative journalist Willem Altmans was able to secure an interview with a very frightened George de Mohrenschildt. This interview resulted in a 40-minute film, but this film disappeared in 1975. On April 2, 1977, Altmans told the House Committee on Assassinations that de Mohrenschildt had discussed with Altmans all aspects of the plot to kill JFK. And here's a quote from Altmans. Quote, de Mohrenschildt told me that Oswald acted as his, de Mohrenschildt's, instructions, and he knew Oswald was going to kill Kennedy, end quote.
Mr. de Mohrenschildt told me in Dallas on the 23rd of February this year, that Oswald acted at his instructions and that they discussed the Kennedy assassination from A to Z, and that he knew that Kennedy was going to kill Oswald was going to kill President Kennedy sooner or later. What he knows about the assassination of President Kennedy, he not only told me, but he gave me a copy of the letter he wrote about this, registered to Senator Frank Church when he ran the CIA investigation, saying, I know who ordered the assassination of John F. Kennedy.
Was any attempt made by any of the people you contacted to follow up on the information?
Well, the amazing thing is that after I gave a copy of the complete letter to both the Select Committee on Assassinations and the President's lawyer for assassinations at the Justice Department, Mr. Robert Keach, they have had it for 6 months. they claim they are unable to find General Donaldson, and they haven't done a damn thing about it.
And Altmans is very credible. He was a newsman for Dutch TV. An investigator for the House Committee on Assassinations named Gaetan Fonzi found that large deposits started showing up in de Mohrenschild's Haitian bank account in 1963, one for $200,000 from a Bahamian bank. Altmans testified for 3 hours behind closed doors to the House Committee on Assassinations. De Mohrenschild's wife and daughter also both confirmed that de Mohrenschildt got Oswald his job in Dallas at a topographical map company called Jaggars, Childs and Stovall. This is before he got his job at the Book Depository building 5 weeks before JFK was killed. Before that, he was working at this topographical map company. Now, the Warren Commission described this topographical map company simply as an advertising agency. But this topographical mapping company was creating highly classified maps for the U.S. Army, including maps of Cuba and the Soviet Union. And one of Oswald's colleagues at this firm was Dennis Offstein. He was the same age as Oswald. Offstein had served in the Army Security Agency, which was part of the National Security Agency. He also was a Russian language specialist. These two were very good friends, and they usually spoke Russian with each other. 3 hours after de Mohrenschildt's relationship with Oswald became public, he was found dead in his house in Palm Beach, Florida. This happened just minutes after Gaetan Fonzi, the investigator with the House Select Committee on Assassinations, came knocking on de Mohrenschildt's door and left his card. He wanted de Mohrenschildt to call him. And here's another fascinating tidbit about de Mohrenschildt's murder. De Mohrenschildt's wife liked to watch soap operas, but she was not going to be home that day. So she set up her audio recorder to record the soap opera. And what's important about that is on that tape you hear beep, 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 which means that the de Mohrenschildt house security system had been breached. Then you hear footsteps. Then you hear a shotgun blast. De Mohrenschildt's death was, of course, ruled a suicide, but he did not commit suicide. Another super interesting figure in Oswald's orbit was David Ferrie. Ferrie was also a CIA operative who had deep connections to the CIA plot to kill JFK. He can be seen in photos with Oswald in the 1950s when they were in the Civil Air Patrol unit together. Oswald joined the Civil Air Patrol at the age of 15 before he enlisted in the Marines. Ferrie denied knowing Oswald, but there are photos of them together. Plus, when Oswald was arrested, David Ferrie's library card was found in Oswald's wallet. And they were both operating out of Guy Bannister's CIA office in New Orleans, which was disguised as Guy Bannister's private investigations office. Guy Bannister was a big deal. He had been the director of the FBI's Chicago office before running a covert CIA office in New Orleans out of this building here. And this was the operation that was being investigated by Jim Garrison, the New Orleans district attorney. And we have the address of this building on this Fair Play for Cuba flyer that Lee Oswald was distributing to buttress his credentials as a pro-Castro communist. The address of this office is right here at 54 Camp Street, New Orleans. And Guy Bannister, who was running this CIA office, was furious with Oswald for including this address on these flyers that Oswald was handing out to people. And the next printing of flyers did not include this address. So this building, the Newman Building, was also the headquarters for Oswald's Fair Play for Cuba Committee, of which Oswald was the only member. And Guy Bannister was working here, compiling files, huge filing cabinets on communists and leftists in New Orleans. And Oswald's job in this operation for Bannister was to infiltrate communist and leftist groups at Tulane University, which is why Oswald formed this Fair Play for Cuba group, of which he was the only member. Oswald was posing as a leftist. He was actually working for Guy Bannister, a fanatical anti-communist, as were David Ferrie and Clay Shaw. And let's listen to Oswald talk when he was posing as a leftist.
No, sir, I'm not a communist, and I think that the red herring and so forth is rather ridiculous to toss into this conversation.
Then are you a Marxist?
Well, I have studied Marxist philosophy, yes, sir, and also other philosophers.
But are you a Marxist? I think you did admit on an earlier radio interview that you consider yourself a Marxist.
Well, I would very definitely say that I am a Marxist. That is correct. But that does not mean, however, that I'm a communist.
What is the difference between the two?
Well, there's a great deal of difference. Several American parties in several countries are based on Marxism, such as Ghana. Certain countries have characteristics of a socialist system, such as Great Britain with its socialized medicine. These, then, are the differences between an outright communist country and countries which adhere to leftist or Marxist principles.
In your work with the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, what are you advocating?
We advocate restoration of diplomatic, trade, and tourist relations with Cuba.
Does he sound like the low IQ loser portrayed by the Warren Commission? This was Oswald working for Guy Bannister in New Orleans trying to infiltrate communist groups on the Tulane campus. Guy Bannister, David Ferry, and Clay Shaw were all fanatical anti-communists trying to overthrow Fidel Castro. They were all involved in the botched Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba in 1961 and were still working to overthrow Castro. They were planning Bay of Pigs too. And David Ferry was close to Jack Ruby, who was also involved in the CIA's Bay of Pigs operation and efforts to overthrow Castro. Yes, I know I told you that Jack Ruby was running guns to Castro in the 1950s. He was on Castro's side back then, but Jack Ruby goes where the money is. He's a criminal. So he switched sides. Jack Ruby was not on anyone's side, but Jack Ruby's side. So Jack Ruby was running guns to the anti-Castro side in the 1960s. David Ferry provided training to Cuban exiles who would then attempt the botched invasion of Cuba in April of 1961. That was the Bay of Pigs. And Ferry's cover job was as a pilot for Eastern Airlines. As part of this botched Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba by the CIA, Ferry had formed what he called the Metairie Falcon Cadet Squadron, which was a CIA operation, and he was flying surveillance missions over Cuba. David Ferry was an expert pilot. And this group was planning a second Bay of Pigs operation for the CIA that would be a direct violation of President Kennedy's policy, which was to leave Cuba alone after the botched Bay of Pigs invasion and after the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. In exchange for getting the Soviets to pull their missiles out of Cuba, Kennedy agreed to be neutral on Cuba, to leave Castro alone. And Kennedy wanted to move toward getting along with Castro. And the CIA was planning to kill Kennedy so it could continue destabilizing Castro. And this group in New Orleans, led by Guy Bannister, that included Clay Shaw, David Ferry, and Lee Harvey Oswald, was part of this ongoing CIA operation to overthrow Castro. David Ferry also had an autoimmune disease called alopecia areata, I think that's how you pronounce it, that caused him to lose his hair. So he wore a wig and had these wild fake eyebrows. David Ferry also had unconventional sexual predilections, which got him fired from Eastern Airlines, which I won't go into here, as I'd prefer not to be demonetized by YouTube if at all possible, though this video will probably be demonetized anyway. David Ferry was also an expert hypnotist, and many have speculated that he was also involved in the CIA's MK-Ultra mind control experiments. New Orleans District Attorney Jim Garrison described Ferry as twisted, but as genuinely brilliant. David Ferry actually had done mathematical calculations on how a person riding in a convertible in a car could be assassinated from a plane with a rifle shot. He said this was possible. Ferry also worked as a pilot for the notorious New Orleans mob boss Carlos Marcello. But David Ferry met an untimely death soon after Jim Garrison, started questioning Ferry about his knowledge of the JFK assassination and his connections with Lee Oswald. When David Ferry was publicly named as an accused co-conspirator in the killing of JFK by the New Orleans District Attorney's Office, Ferry told a Garrison staff member, quote, "You know what this news story does to me, don't you? I'm a dead man. From here on, believe me, I'm a dead man." And indeed, Ferry was a dead man less than a week later on February 22, 1967. Dead from an aneurysm. Natural causes was the official line, even though he's perfectly healthy. Causing brain aneurysms is among the CIA's favorite ways of killing people. And David Ferrie left 2 suicide notes. That's right, 2 suicide notes. Huh? Guy Bannister, who was running that CIA office in New Orleans, also died of a heart attack 7 months after JFK's killing. Bannister being the man who Lee Oswald reported to directly. Guy Bannister is a key character in Oliver Stone's 1991 movie JFK, in which he is portrayed by Ed Asner. So everyone in that New Orleans CIA operation ended up meeting an untimely death, including Lee Oswald, Guy Bannister, David Ferrie, and Clay Shaw, plus Jack Ruby, who, though based in Dallas, spent a lot of time in New Orleans with these characters. No wonder Jim Garrison was having trouble securing convictions. But wait, let's back up. Why would the CIA want to kill President John F. Kennedy? Well, for many reasons, but one reason that's relevant today is that the CIA does not see the president and our elected leaders as the true government of the United States. To the CIA, presidents and elected officials are just placeholders, passers-by. They're like temp workers. The real government is the CIA, also the permanent bureaucracy, including the FBI, the State Department, the military, and the other 17 intelligence agencies. But the CIA is the head of the snake because the CIA is allowed to operate in complete secrecy, with almost no oversight whatsoever. And we see how this works all the time. Whenever Congress subpoenas documents and records from the CIA, Congress just gets stonewalled and ignored. Even the president is ignored by the CIA. Even the president can't find out what's happening at the CIA. And if documents are eventually produced, usually after many months and years of subpoenas, the documents arrive heavily redacted. The key information blacked out, sometimes entire pages blacked out. This behavior by the CIA more than frustrated Kennedy. He couldn't get answers about anything. And before his assassination, JFK had made it clear he wanted to, quote, splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds. JFK was furious over the CIA's botched invasion of Cuba in an attempt to overthrow Fidel Castro on April 17, 1961, just 3 months after JFK was sworn into office as president. Fidel Castro, a communist supported by the Soviet Union, came to power in 1959, and the United States was freaked out about it. A Soviet satellite country was now 90 miles off our shore. And the CIA hatched a plan to provide military training to 1,400 Cuban exiles for an invasion of Cuba to topple the Castro regime. This invasion, called the Bay of Pigs invasion, was a fiasco in every respect, easily defeated by Castro. Castro just had to surround the 1,400 invaders, poorly trained invaders, with his army of 25,000 troops. And Kennedy blamed the CIA for making him look like an incompetent fool. Kennedy saw this as an operation he had inherited that he really had nothing to do with. Yes, he went along with it, but he'd only been president for 3 months. He blamed CIA Director Allen Dulles for the fiasco. But he did not fire Dulles immediately. He fired Dulles 7 months later when he learned about Operation Northwoods. And what was Operation Northwoods? Operation Northwoods was a CIA-planned false flag operation where the CIA would frame Fidel Castro for launching terrorist attacks on American soldiers and even on American cities, killing civilians. These attacks would actually be conducted by the CIA against Americans. Then the U.S. government would blame Castro. And the plan was to publish fake American casualty lists for broadcast on the evening news. And the CIA would pay these anti-Castro exiles in America to pretend to be attackers, to pretend to be terrorists, and then fake arrest these fake terrorists. The CIA would even stage fake funerals for fake victims, along with fabricated sad stories and fake weeping family members for broadcast by the CIA-controlled TV news. And the plan was to have the media report that America had been attacked by Fidel Castro. And the purpose of this, the purpose of Operation Northwoods, was to justify an all-out U.S. military invasion of Cuba to overthrow the Castro regime. And the U.S. military's Joint Chiefs of Staff, the generals, they were all on board with this plan. Sound familiar? Remember the Iraq War? The CIA persuaded a hapless President George W. Bush that Saddam Hussein was developing nuclear weapons and had something to do with the 9/11 attack. George W. Bush believed the CIA, so invaded Iraq, killing 500,000 Iraqis and some say upwards of 1 million Iraqis. 4,500 American soldiers died in the Iraq War, plus 60,000 wounded Americans, all at a cost of around $1 trillion to American taxpayers. Nothing at all was accomplished by this war. In fact, Saddam Hussein was a much-needed counterforce to the much more dangerous Iran. Saddam Hussein was certainly a brutal dictator, but also a killer of al-Qaeda and terrorist groups. Same with Bashar Assad, by the way, in Syria, who we helped ISIS take out for some reason. And similar lies persuaded us to dramatically escalate the war in Vietnam. We were told by our government that the North Vietnamese had attacked 2 U.S. ships in the Gulf of Tonkin in August of 1964. So then Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution that allowed President Lyndon Johnson to do whatever he wanted in Vietnam, which was escalate the U.S. war dramatically and spectacularly in Vietnam. There were even proposals coming out of the CIA and Joint Chiefs of Staff to use tactical nukes in Vietnam. So then the U.S. military presence in Vietnam went from 11,000 non-combatant advisors by the end of JFK's presidency to 600,000 combat troops under President LBJ. Then it turned out that the 2 U.S. ships in the Gulf of Tonkin were probably not attacked by North Vietnam. One ship was not attacked at all, and the attack on the other ship, if there was even an attack, was greatly exaggerated. So the CIA lied us into the war in Iraq and lied us into the war in Vietnam. And CIA Director Allen Dulles was trying to lie us into invading Cuba with Operation Northwoods. Actually planned to launch terrorist attacks on U.S. cities and blame these attacks on Castro. Yeah. Now, Allen Dulles, he had been a top official in the OSS, that is the Office of Strategic Services, which was the World War II precursor to the CIA. In the early 1930s, Dulles met Adolf Hitler, met Benito Mussolini, and Hitler's chief propagandist, Joseph Goebbels. After his meeting with Goebbels, Dulles expressed admiration for Joseph Goebbels. That's who is leading our CIA. He thought Joseph Goebbels was just fantastic, a genius. He modeled himself after Joseph Goebbels. Allen Dulles also launched Operation Paperclip that brought German Nazi scientists, engineers, and technicians to the United States after World War II. Many of these scientists were literally German war criminals, Nazi war criminals, but escaped prosecution in the Nuremberg trials by agreeing to work for the United States, including helping the CIA develop the notorious MK-Ultra mind control program.
Assisted by the German scientists, the Americans begin pursuing their goal of the ultimate weapon, and everything is allowed in the name of the Cold War. The CIA was above all interested in psychological manipulation. Their goal was to create an infallible truth serum, wipe memories, turn humans into robots, and program them to kill.
That's who Allen Dulles was. Literally an admirer of Joseph Goebbels. And we know for a fact that the Unabomber underwent 3 years of MK-Ultra mind control experiments when he was a student at Harvard. We also know that Charles Manson and his closest followers were products of MK-Ultra. A man named Dr. Louis Jolyon West, or Jolly West, was a top psychiatrist with MK-Ultra. And I covered Jolly West's involvement with Charles Manson and Manson's followers in this video here. And all this is documented in this great book here by investigative journalist Tom O'Neill called Chaos: The Secret History of the CIA, Charles Manson, and the 1960s. O'Neill worked for 20 years on this book. This book includes 63 pages of endnotes. Dr. Jolly West is a key figure in the Charles Manson saga, and he's a key figure in the silencing of Jack Ruby. He might also have been involved in the creation of Lee Oswald, though I can't document that. Jolly West met with Jack Ruby alone in his cell in April of 1964, shortly before Jack Ruby was to testify before the Warren Commission. Now, Jack Ruby was fine right before he met with Jolly West, but then Ruby went permanently insane right after his meeting with Jolly West, which was days before Ruby was to testify before the Warren Commission. So Ruby's testimony to the Warren Commission was very disoriented and confused.
Facing God. Yet people can go on being inseparable in their feelings in love to their brother, regardless of what faith they believe in. And it's been proven to me in my incarceration. He lets me believe in the origin of Genesis and all the various starting of the world, and he enlightened me to these various parts of religion that I didn't grasp, because if you go to the synagogue or the temple,
He was also in a panic. Ruby kept telling the commission that he would soon be killed by the CIA. Justice Earl Warren kept assuring Ruby that he would not be killed and promised that Ruby would be protected. Now, Jack Ruby's conviction in his first trial was overturned due to a biased venue. He was granted a new trial to be held in Wichita, Kansas in February of 1967, where he was expected to tell everything he knew about the plot to kill JFK. But Ruby ended up dead 1 month before his new trial was supposed to start. More on Ruby's shocking and mysterious death in a bit. And be sure to follow me on X. I'm posting all the time. I link to my X account below. Also, check out my books on Amazon, which are available in all the formats. Also linked below. One is Bitcoin, a beginner's guide. Bitcoin is free to money because it's unconfiscatable money, so long as you self-custody your Bitcoin. And Bitcoin protects you from the government's fiat money printer because there will never be more than 21 million Bitcoins for 8 billion people. Bitcoin removes humans from the governance of the money. Bitcoin separates money from state. So Bitcoin is uncorruptible money. Bitcoin is the Second Amendment for your money. If the shit hits the fan here and we become a totalitarian country, you're going to want to be able to carry your wealth with you to wherever freedom might still exist. That's what Bitcoin is for. The second book is Win Life, Success Skills Schools Don't Teach. This book is primarily aimed at young people who are just getting launched in life, but will help anyone who wants to be in the top 1% of income and wealth. Or maybe you have more modest goals. Maybe you're just interested in losing 20 pounds. This book will help you do that as well. This book will help you achieve most of what you want to achieve in life.